1997's Final Fantasy VII is regarded by many as one of the best JRPGs ever made. A fantastic combination of various elements, from narrative structure, graphical advances, and innovative game mechanics, all combining to make it a spectacle of late 1990s game design. And yet, it is perhaps, more than anything, the motley cast of characters that feature in the story that endure most consistently in popular consciousness today. And among them, Vincent Valentine, who has had considerable evolution and varying depictions in Final Fantasy VII material since the game's first release. So, how has Vincent Valentine changed over time? What intrinsic and extrinsic cultural factors have contributed to these changes? And how might we judge his changing role and inclusion in the oeuvre of Final Fantasy VII? Jumping right in and taking ourselves back to the original 1997 game, it's interesting to consider Vincent Valentine's context here. Along with Yuffie Kisaragi, he is one of the 2 optional playable characters that we could obtain in the game, and it was something of an open secret since both of these characters featured in the gamebook. So what his inclusion as an optional character did here was firstly create an intriguing desire for the player to pursue the side quests and do what was required to obtain him. But secondly, owing to Vincent's particular characterization and design as an optional character, he very much added to this mystique and detachment, which he very much carries through this original title. Indeed, upon encountering him at the mansion in Nibelheim, his tendency to speak in ambiguous, self-flagellatory riddles with talk of sins and punishment when we're trying to recruit him, the fact that he sleeps in a coffin in a basement and frequently rejects our overtures to speak with him at all, builds this sense of aloof removal from our main party and our main party's endeavours. In this regard, he's not entirely dissimilar to pioneering characters like Shadow, who featured in Final Fantasy VI, who likewise is dangled in front of the player in several instances before we're able to obtain him, and has his own particular detachment and dilemma that skirts around the central story of FF6. For Vincent's part, this was doubly so, since by his very nature he is tormented by and a product of past events. His link to the contemporary story is quite tenuous, since while he does orbit the story of Shinra, the Turks and Hojo, and indeed Sephiroth, who are major players here in the main story, everything about Vincent is much more wrapped up in the origins of these characters, rather than the Meteor Fall arc that Cloud Strife is venturing through. As such, his inclusion in Final Fantasy VII proper is marginal at best, and, for example, whenever you bring him with you as a party member, his dialogue options and reactions to things might be a bit more muted and generic than other characters like Tifa or Barrett, unless of course there is something specific to Vincent's own past, like an observation of Hojo or the Shinra, and so on, in which case you can sometimes get some neat little insights and observations out of him. This being said, while Vincent Valentine doesn't necessarily move the dial much on current events in the 1997 game, he is a fantastic contribution to the world building, the sense of density and history in Final Fantasy VII. And perhaps the best example of that, outside of his occasional dialogues that I mentioned, is the secret location of Lucrecia's cave, and it's here where, having successfully obtained Vincent, we get a very telling flashback sequence from his time as a Turk. We get this idea of his forlorn love for Lucrecia, and a glimpse into the tragic events that turned him into the reclusive monster that he is today. In terms of design and demeanour in 1997 Vincent, he was instantly distinct and iconic among the party. Something of a horror pastiche conceived through a Japanese lens. Everything from Vincent's theme tune to his cowled black and red attire to the fact he sleeps in a coffin and seems to defy gravity leans into pop cultural ideas of the vampire, specifically the iconic modern conceptions of vampires that were thought up by Bram Stoker and Sheridan Le Fanu. And beyond this, looking to Vincent's transformative limit breaks, we have further pop cultural horror references with a Frankenstein-esque Gygas, the werewolf-like Galian beast, and the chainsaw-wielding Hellmasker, which variously nod to cinematic history, whether that's the Hammer horror films of Christopher Lee, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and so on. And so, looking at this weird vampirical transformative character that turns into weird Frankensteins and stuff, one may be forgiven for thinking that Vincent Valentine was something of a joke character, and indeed it does verge on the ridiculous that a vampire Halloween trope sort of character might fit harmoniously into a dystopian cyberpunk world, and yet it very much did work, and the delicate balance of the sincere, mysterious drama that follows Vincent around. On top of that, this very iconic design, it did secure Vincent as a niche fan favourite back in 1997 in the very first game. That being said, what came next for Vincent was somewhat unexpected for many fans of Final Fantasy VII, with the publication of compilation Final Fantasy VII material from the mid-2000s onwards. And it was here that Vincent had an appearance in the prequel game, Before Crisis, as a Turk, and yet a comparatively large role in the sequel movie, 2005's Advent Children. And indeed, while being something of an austere, grade, tech demo sort of movie where the flourishes of character costumes and colour palettes were toned right down, and that includes major characters like Cloud Strife and Tifa, Vincent Valentine was, among the cast in this film, one of the few characters who were really dialed up in terms of their design, the attentiveness to the animation, the costume and all of that sort of thing. It was very clear that effort was put into the way Vincent moved, acted, reacted to things in the film, so actually he was quite a major feature in this film, and appeared in quite a few scenes. Additionally, like many other Final Fantasy VII characters who had not featured in Kingdom Hearts, and I'm going to assume we're excluding Urgites here, as Vincent did feature in Urgites with a voice character for his Barks, Vincent was given his first English voice actor in Steve Blum here, who really added another dimension to the mystery and overall cool reserve, and I think maturity too, that Vincent had really conveyed since the first game. And Tetsuya Nomura had actually stated here in interviews about the film, he was very consciously looking for a voice actor that would oppose the voice type of Cloud Strife, because there was always concern that these two characters could become too close in demeanour and edginess, and so cancel one another out, I suppose. And that's an observation that I'd previously made in a very early video about FF7 as well, when thinking about why Vincent is so comparatively marginal in the original game. I do agree, I think there isn't necessarily room for two brooding characters in this ensemble story. So Advent Children, it was a clear celebration of Vincent as a character. He had some great input in both action and dialogue sequences through that film. There were also degrees of warmth and comedy introduced subtly to his character here too, with Marlene Wallace kind of hiding beneath his cowl, Vincent later asking the party where he can buy a phone. So it seems here from the film that alongside the Turks and characters like Rufus, the writers really wanted Vincent to be elevated a little bit more, to celebrate him a little bit more, which in hindsight seems like a clear establishing shot for his next major venture, the 2006 game Dirge of Cerberus. Now, Dirge of Cerberus was for many a very weird game. Vincent Valentine is a favourite character for a lot of people, but as mentioned, up until this point, he was much more of an accessory character to Cloud's story and a contribution to the world building that surrounded Cloud more than anything else. Dirge of Cerberus, in its decision to not just focus solely on Vincent, but also to depart from the JRPG genre in favour of an action shooter, was then a pretty bold move, and one that, for a number of reasons, I think was met with mixed reception. Personally, I did enjoy the game at release. It's not a favourite of mine, but I thought the cutscene graphics for the time were phenomenal, the soundtrack was great, all of that sort of thing. The gameplay was a bit of a mixed bag, and many dissenters of the compilation project as a whole disliked that Dirge of Cerberus was even made in the first place. And indeed, I think much like Genesis featuring Crisis Core, and the characters and the timeline of Dirge of Cerberus does leave Final Fantasy VII in something of a weird loose end, open thread of story, even to this day. But aside from all of that, focusing solely on Vincent here, the game did move the dial on him quite a lot. It showed a very different shade and dimension to his character by pulling back the veil on the drama and the mystery of his past. It really dived into that and worked hard to give him a heroic redemption arc to embark on. So Dirge of Cerberus worked really well to this end, to reconcile the moody gothic disposition of Vincent. They leaned into the cool factor still with, the gacked soundtrack, a storyline that showed Vincent's relationship to chaos, which is obviously a very cool element of his character too. But likewise, it didn't shy away from making him a very obvious, overt protagonist here too. It shook off some of the mystique and the closed-off demeanour we saw in the 1997 game. And I think looking at the amount of historicity and the events of the past that do directly involve Vincent, particularly his proximity to Shinra, his proximity to characters like Hojo, who many, I think, rightly argue is a major antagonist in this series, arguably more so than Sephiroth and Genova, it does in a way make sense that they would centre a game on him in a way, because it builds out those elements of the story that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise see in a Cloud Strife story. So that's Dirge of Cerberus, an interesting but quite unexpected shift for Vincent there in 2006. Fast forwarding to the Final Fantasy VII Remake era, this is the next pivotal juncture for how Vincent Valentine is written. And it's an interesting period to sort of look at and reassess Vincent, because as has been noted not by myself but actually by my good friend Nukvi from the Birds of Play YouTube channel, Vincent Valentine debuted back in 1997 and was heavily used during the compilation in a period extrinsic to Final Fantasy that we might reasonably call peak vampire, or at least a period where vampirical characters were kind of cool. So we had movies like Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman, From Dusk Till Dawn, Blade, Interview with a Vampire, to name but a few. They were all released in the years orbiting Final Fantasy VII's original release. TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer were really popular television. Bands like Cradle of Filth were in their heyday, and there was a sort of zeitgeisty edginess to the undead vampirical genre and trope. By the end of the 2000s, in no small part thanks to movies like Twilight and TV shows like True Blood, and a general oversaturation of the genre by the end of that decade, I think, vampires became somewhat passé, and returning to Nukvi's point, a character like Vincent Valentine may not have the same appeal today were he to be designed and sort of given the demeanour, this edginess and such as he had in the original 1997 game. And this is a really interesting point to sort of look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth with, because as if prescient of this, Vincent and the main party members' reactions to Vincent have been written with an almost self-awareness about his absurdity, and Square have really leaned into the comical elements of him and a more comical rendition of Vincent, with his incomprehension of modern technology being a lasting source of amusement, an example of that players took from the game. But what's been really well done here, I think, is how they haven't compromised Vincent himself in trying to elicit this humour. They haven't undermined his character, and what I mean by that is Vincent Valentine isn't aware that he's funny, and indeed he's just as self-depreciating and brooding and severe as he always was, if not a bit more so. And I think in a post-vampire being cool era, this was definitely the best approach to take with him. Beyond just looking at his slightly more comical demeanour in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, however, there is definitely a fresh arc at work with Vincent too, and with many players now being aware of his backstory and familiarised with the original game and the compilation, whether having played them or looked at it on wikis or whatever, Rebirth Vincent seems to have an arc that is slightly more focused on creating a sense of belonging, looking for a relationship to be fostered within the central party, while also hinting at a further exploration of his history with and relationship with the Turks, as we saw in the Temple of the Ancients sequence at the end of that game. There is then, it seems, more of a theme of allegiance and, as I say, a sense of belonging at play within Vincent Valentine in this new set of games that will perhaps further explore his history with Shinra and new and interesting ways that he could be interacting and building a rapport with the main party members, without necessarily, I think, looking to elevate him again, since I think we have clearly tapered back down and returned to the Cloud Strife focused ensemble story. So there we have it, a look at Vincent Valentine, who was a very interesting and unlikely character to sort of shift from this accessory sort of optional character, rising all the way to prominence to sort of helm his own game within Final Fantasy VII, and then back down again to become a very amusing while still interesting and engaging supporting character in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.